Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Starfleet Tactical. I'm your host, Alec Peters, with my illustrious guest panelists, Chris Weave and Pat Doyle. Oops, what is that?
That was me. I've got it up on Facebook.
I guess we should say not guest panelists, but like co-hosts. That's more appropriate.
That works.
So, how are you guys doing? You guys having a good week?
Good week, yes.
Yeah, pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you?
What have you been up to?
I have mostly been working all week. Just kind of. Actually, it's been a pretty busy week. Working in the simulators, and then just working on some stuff for the Navy. So, it's been 2 jobs have been keeping me busy.
Very good. And Chris?
So I've just been doing my day job basically.
Which you can't talk about.
Well, I can mostly talk about it. I do wargaming stuff for the Air Force, and we're spending a lot of time thinking about how you do wargaming in a distributed environment. And there's little groups of people here and there that are thinking about it, and we're, hey, like, you're thinking about that, I'm thinking about that. Let's exchange stuff. And next thing I know, I've volunteered to like do 3 or 4 presentations to various people about how to make this stuff happen. So
let me ask you. Let me ask you a meta question here.
Okay.
About wargaming and what's going on. So I would assume that most of the wargaming, I mean, what percentage of wargaming do you do? I say you, does the establishment, the military establishment do that actually is you have to deal with in real life? Like, we're going to wargame this scenario and it actually happens and it's actually relevant. And how much of it is just kind of speculative? I got to imagine 99% of it is just speculative.
So there's a lot of different reasons why you wargame.
Okay.
So at its most fundamental level, you can sort of break it into wargaming for training and education on the one hand versus wargaming for analysis on the other hand. And so from that standpoint, you know, for training and education, a lot of it fits in the category of batting practice.
Right. Got it.
So you're trying to, for the training part, it's really batting practice. For the educational part, it's like, how do you think about this problem, right? It's teaching people how to think. If you
Which
go back
is a
to
critical skill. I just want to say it's a critical skill because it's the difference between my education at law school and getting an MBA. In law school, they teach you how to think like a lawyer. In business school, they teach you the tactics of business.
Yeah.
It's totally different educations. And my argument has always been that a legal education is the best education for a business if you're going to be an entrepreneur, because it just teaches. Anyway, that so I really relate to the point you just made about teaching people how to think rather than teaching X's and O's.
Now, on the analysis side, you can do war games for a bunch of different reasons. You can do wargaming because you've got a very specific problem that you're trying to get an answer to. And wargaming by itself won't tell you the answer, but it can tell you if you're on the right track or not. It can tell you, it can sort of illustrate things that are areas for further discussion. It can be like what is known as course of action analysis war games. Like we're getting ready to go invade somebody. Let's do a little quick war game to sort of figure out what we should be thinking about, right? So the general, like, pick 3 different options and we'll do a quick little war game and sort of work our way through it. So that's at the very low end of the scale. On the high end of the scale, you might have a war game that says 40 years from now, what sort of stuff would be useful for us to have? And so, like, a lot of the science and technology war games are sort of predicated on the idea, the stuff that we buy now is the stuff we're going to be using in 20 or 30 years. The stuff that we start developing now is the stuff we're going to be using in 20 or 30 years. So what should we be working on now to win the fight in 20 or 30 years? Now, it's important to remember that nobody is going to be making a decision 25 years from now based upon the results of a game that takes place today, right? So, because people, when I was working in my last job where I was an analyst for the intelligence community and I was doing long range stuff like that in support of acquisition programs, people would say, well, how can you expect me to do this? How can you expect me to get it right? And you don't need to get it perfect, because what we're really looking for in that sort of situation is It's the equivalent of Frodo leaving Rivendell. The ringmaster is going to lead us to Mordor. He comes out the gate. Does he turn left or does he turn right? So that's really the decision you're asking for when you're doing like a long-term war game or long-term analysis. Do I turn left or do I turn right? The first step when a ship leaves harbor, like you're leaving harbor in Norfolk and you're going to Africa, start off by heading east. The rest of it is a detail that can be worked out later. So a lot of this is just basically like, am I going east or am I going north sort of stuff, right? And as I used to always tell people, we're asking you to do a 20-year projection. In 2 years from now, we're going to ask you to do another 20-year projection. So the projection you do today is the one that we'll use to make today's decisions. In 2 years, that projection will be the one that we'll use to make the decisions in 2 years. So don't worry about it, right? We're not expecting you to get it 100% correct.
Gotcha.
These are long lead time decisions. We need some input into that.
Gotcha.
So, and from an analysis standpoint, a lot of times what they're doing, like in the Pentagon, they'll do war games where what they're doing is they're looking at war plans. Mark Herman is a war gamer of some renown. He one of the things about the professional war gamers out there, you've got the people that do like work for DoD and do stuff like that, and there's a lot of them that have really deep expertise and they've been doing it forever. And then on the hobby side, you've got people that have been doing hobby war gaming for a long time and they've got really deep expertise and they've been doing it forever. The intersection of those two circles, the overlap, is really pretty small.
I gotta imagine it is.
Yeah, and it's not because there aren't people, because people don't go back and forth. They do, right? Like almost all of the professional war gamers I know, or a big chunk of them, have a lot of interest in hobby wargaming too.
Right.
And vice versa. And sometimes they, like the SPI, Jim Dunnigan used to get called in to consult to the Defense Department. He's doing hobby wargaming, but he'd get asked to consult with those guys. The thing that makes Mark Herman different, though, is that Mark worked at SPI for a long time. Then he went and worked for DoD for a long time, basically was a professional wargamer at DoD for like 15 years. And then he's now doing hobby stuff. And while also doing stuff, he worked for Booz Allen Hamilton for a long time. He's now retired from Booz, and he's back to just being a hobby game designer. But he spent basically 30 years as a hobby game designer as his night job, and a DoD professional wargamer as his day job. So he's like the intersection of this. He may be the most experienced gamer in the wargame designer in the history of mankind.
Oh my God. Well,
and the reason why I mention him is that if you go to YouTube and you do a search for Georgetown University Wargaming Society, Mark Herman, you can find a talk that he did about 2 months ago, where he talks about all the different stuff he did for DoD. And basically he had a job where for 10 years, all he did was war game out war plans. So we've got this war plan in case the balloon goes up, and he was the guy doing the gaming where they come back and they say, we found a few problems, or that seemed to work pretty well.
Now, I got to imagine if you're talking about that Venn diagram of wargaming and hobby wargaming, is the intersection, that really, really small piece of intersection, is that all game theory?
No. So game theory is an interesting subject in and of itself, because game theory has some interesting predictive value, but not really of the sort that you would use in a professional war game. It's an interesting decision analysis tool. I used to think that game theory was just a waste of time. I've since, having studied it a little bit more when I was up in Newport, I came to the conclusion that it actually is an interesting decision-aiding tool. But the only time I ever saw game theory used in relation to professional wargaming was an instance where we were trying to do a game for somebody, and this other part of DoD wasn't cooperating. They'd sort of been told to cooperate, but they weren't. And it's like, why aren't they cooperating? And so one of my colleagues over the weekend sort of sat down and spent a lot of time thinking it out and sort of drawing decision trees, et cetera, et cetera. And he came to the conclusion that there was absolutely no payoff for these recalcitrant people to actually help us. They couldn't, it did not help them to help us.
Right.
It potentially could be really bad for their pet rocks. And so he came back on Monday and he said, yeah, they're never going to help us. They're going to sabotage this project. And that's exactly what happened.
Wow.
That's the only time I've ever seen game theory actually impact a real world game.
Interesting. Okay, that's interesting. Well, very, very cool. So getting back to my question, in effect, the answer to my question is that's not necessarily the guiding factor for war games. Is how often are they ever put into play, because the training and value of them is critical, and also, as you pointed out, they become obsolete before they even have a chance, because you're reinventing.
And so, war games are an interesting tool. Modeling and simulation is an interesting tool. My former boss, Peter Perla, who literally, so I've been fortunate in that I have as friends of mine the two people who literally wrote the books on wargaming. And those two books are Peter Perla's The Art of Wargaming, which came out in 1990 from the Naval Institute Press, still like the Bible of professional wargaming, and a much more recent book by a guy named Matt Caffrey, who's the guy who sits in the cubicle next to me and the reason why I came to my current job. And Matt wrote a book called On Wargaming. On Wargaming has the advantage of being a free download from the U.S. Naval War College. And it's, I think he said it's been downloaded something like 12,000 times, which is like 3 times as much as all the other things that they've ever published put together, or something like that. And so,
I'm going to put these in the comments section here. Here's the download for On Wargaming. Listen, maybe you can put these in the actual information box for these videos, but there's the that is On Wargaming.
And the Art of Wargaming by Peter Perla is in its 2nd edition, and it's published through
Why did it not appear on the
I can't remember what the name of the it's John Curry, and
here on Amazon you can pick up The Art of Wargaming. I'll post
Good.
I'll post that one there as well. So there are those two, which I'm sure Peter Perla is hardcover.
Peter, in his book, he talks about something called the cycle of research, where you've got analysis and you've got modeling and simulation. You've got modeling and simulation, real world exercises, and war games, and analysis, tying them all together. And a lot of it is you should try to use the tool that's appropriate for the question that you've got, with the assumption that you're going to get results from that tool that you're going to want to then dump into the other tools as appropriate to sort of figure out what things are going on. So like if what you want is a number, for instance, like how many carrier battle groups should I have? A war game isn't going to give you a number.
No. Sorry, keep going.
A war game isn't going to give you a number as an answer, because war games are inherently about human decision making. They're not about like a quantitative answer. They're very much a qualitative answer. On the other hand, if you want to know about the human decision making, you can't use modeling and simulation for the human decision making stuff, because all the human decision making takes place before you run the model and you do the modeling and sim stuff. So I oftentimes will give the example of the sorts of things that might come out of a war game that are interesting. If you change the probability of kill of a missile from 0.5, a 50% probability of kill, to a 0.95, and the end result in the game is that everybody uses that missile and they kill a lot of things, that's not really that interesting, because it killing a lot of things, that's actually an input, right? The PK is an input to it. If you kill more things, that's really kind of just a reflection of the fact that you change the input. Okay, you don't really need to have a war game to tell you that. If what you do is you change that probability of kill from 0.5 to 0.95, and the players don't see that as important, and it doesn't change their strategy, that is interesting. That's the sort of thing where I go, well, hell, What about this problem do I not understand that I thought, I thought that this would make a difference, and it doesn't. There's something really interesting going on there. And I need to sort of figure out what's going on. So, over the years, let's see, I worked at the Center for Naval Analysis for Peter Perla for 6 years. And then I went off to the Naval War College, and I was on the Wargaming faculty there for 5 years. And then I sort of took most of the 2010s off to go work at another job. And now I'm back doing wargaming again. So, but I kept my oar in the water. So I've been basically doing professional wargaming stuff for a little over 20 years now.
Wow.
It's really the set of tools together are what's interesting. There's a lot of people out there that will try to tell you that, oh, this will answer all your questions. And no, it really won't. It really won't.
Gotcha. By the way, I'm going to just show real quick my screen here because I'm let's see. There's a if you're interested out there in wargaming, this is just some of what Amazon's throwing my way now that I've searched Peter Perla's.
So let me tell you about these books, because I know about all of them except one.
And first of all, here's Peter Perla's book.
Yeah,
Wargaming, a guide for.
So that's the first edition. There's a second edition that I think is on that list down at the bottom. And so go back
here.
Okay. So if you look on the far left-hand side, Peter Perla's The Art of Wargaming, a guide for, that's the same book. It says it's written by John Curry, but he's actually the publisher. So that's the same book as that, except that's the edition that came out about 5 years ago. Peter didn't really update it much. I think if I remember correctly, he took an essay or two and put it on the back of it. But I also think that maybe that one you can get as an ebook. I think. I'm not positive. Okay. Phil Sabin's Simulating War is a book that came out about maybe 10 years ago now. And he was the head of the wargaming group at King's College London, and is just basically, he's one of the names, and he uses wargames in his classes, or he did. He's now retired. He uses it in his classes. Zones of Control: Perspectives on Wargaming. That's a collection of essays. It's got some really good stuff in it. The next two books are the same book. It's the second and third edition. The blue cover is the third edition. The Complete Wargames Handbook by Jim Dunnigan. Now, Jim's done some really good stuff. He was the founder of SPI. He's one of the most prolific game designers ever. And I think he sometimes has a tendency to he's not really been doing much game design over the course of the last 15 years or so. And he sort of forgets that people continued to innovate after he got out of it. But that's a really great book because he goes through and designs a simple game for you. So if you're interested in like board wargaming type stuff, it's a good book to give you a snapshot of the state of the art of about 20 years ago, how to think about the problem. The next book I've never seen before, but I'm going to get it.
Rick Priestley.
Yeah, Rick Priestley, of course, is the guy who did the original Warhammer 40K Rogue Trader. The last book, the Matrix Games book by John Curry, that there's actually other people in there also. I think that was actually written by Tim Price. Tim Price in quotes, because Tim Price is a pseudonym for a couple of different people who do war game. One of them does like electronic warfare stuff professionally. The other guy does wargaming stuff professionally, and his employer said, yeah, you can publish this book, but don't use your name. And so if you see anything that's on wargaming by Tim Price, he's very good. And Matrix games are sort of a hobby type. You can do it for hobby stuff, or you can do it for professional stuff. The shortest war game design cycle I ever saw was a Matrix game that I was part of, where we literally designed a game on Sunday that we executed with 70 players the next day.
Wow. Okay.
Now, we had the advantage of, we knew what the topic was going to be. We had invited all the players. I had to fly from Newport to Hawaii for this thing. So it wasn't, we knew basically what the scenario was going to be, but we really didn't have any game mechanisms. And we sat down and came up with some very simple game mechanisms. Like, I'm going to do X. I expect it will have these effects. and these are the 3 reasons why I think I will be successful. All right, does anybody in the audience have any complaints with that? If they did, we'd talk it out, and then the judge would make, the adjudicators would say, all right, we're going to say that worked. And you can do some surprisingly good work with a simple, especially if you're not trying to do it for analysis purposes. We kind of were, but part of it is we were trying to get buy-in on some things. You can do some really good work with a really simple sort of mechanism like that. And so matrix games are really sort of the big thing. All those other books that you saw up there were, I mean, they're all, some of the classics in the field are there. I've got almost all of them.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that's a good primer for everyone on wargaming. Let's get to the subject at hand. Let's dive back into Star Trek and talk about photon torpedoes versus phasers. And let's at least move this up. Let's get out of TOS because they didn't know what the hell they were dealing with back then. And sometimes phasers look like photon torpedoes, and some were blue, and some were red, and some were green. Whatever. Let's just make the assumption that we're in the next generation, and these are 2 different weapons. I
was talking with Pat earlier today, or maybe it was yesterday. I can't remember. I've talked with Pat like 5 times in the last 36 hours.
Sorry.
And I made the observation that if you look at it, the Orville is closer to the next generation in terms of how the technology works than the original series is.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. I'm sure.
So,
well, let's talk.
Pat and I actually put together a little comparison chart.
All right, let's see it.
All right,
Pat, we'll turn it over to you. Okay. I'm guessing you're the one that has the chart up.
No, I've got it up, so I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Can you share it?
Okay. You know what? Hold on a second. Let me move it from one monitor to another, and then let's see if I can do. Okay. So I'm running into the problem you run into when you haven't tested something in PowerPoint.
There we go. I'll add it to the stream. There we go.
Oh, okay. So let me make it bigger. If I try to actually, can you guys read that? Yeah. If I try to actually serve it up, the problem is that I will lose the ability to get to StreamYard and do anything else on it, because of the way PowerPoint, works. So maybe I can make it a little bit bigger this way too. Also.
There you go. That's
you can zoom in on a specific area and move down.
So, or you know what? Hold on a second.
You know what you can also do? You can also save it as a screenshot.
I just realized if I put it on the other monitor, if I swap monitors real quick, hold on a second. Sorry about this.
Yeah, not a problem.
If I swap monitors real quick, I think it will work better. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and then I'm going to share again, and I will select the other monitor.
I want to know who is out there watching tonight on my personal Facebook page.
Okay, it's not showing, is it?
Now
you have to do it.
There you go.
There it is.
All right.
All right.
Much better.
Yeah. Okay.
Much better.
So we were just thinking about this, and so I sort of put together this little chart, and then
I'm going to do this, make it even better,
and asked Pat to. Okay, let me make it a little bit smaller because it turns out I cut off an entire row down at the bottom. And asked Pat to sort of populate it, and then I sort of went through and did some stuff too. And we really only we looked at 4 different pieces of this because it's sort of interesting seeing how all this fits together. I think at this point, the right answer is for me to stop talking and let Pat talk until we get down to some of the things down at the bottom, because as Pat knows, these are my pet rocks, and I'm going to want to talk about my pet rock. So over to you, Pat.
Okay. All right. So we talked about, we've got TOS there as a comparison. Next generation, obviously, they solidified it and made it a little more technical, and for the most part tried to be more consistent about things. But just for giggles, we included a war game in there that was created in 1975, late 70s sometime, by Steve Cole. and it was a Star Trek based on the old series, Starship Combat game. So just different ways to look at it. And it was purely based on TOS. They've never been allowed to use any of the other Next Generation or movie era type stuff in their game. So, anyways, in Next Generation, we'll start off with that. Basically, phasers. One of the very simple ways to look at it right now is based on the way they have done it for the Next Generation. Is that phasers are your guns. If you compare it to a modern naval vessel, photon torpedoes are your missiles. They are your long-range weapon, and phasers are essentially your guns. They're the shorter-range weapons. A lot of the earlier games tended to, and interpretations depicted it as, phasers, your beam weapons were your really long-range weapons, and your photon torpedoes and stuff were your really short range but hard hitting weapons. So that's the difference, is once we get into the Next Generation and how things eventually developed. So basically, when we look at phasers, they have a range of about 300,000 kilometers, and that's considered the effective range. So presumably the beam doesn't just hit a wall and evaporate. It keeps going, and you probably could hit something farther out. Presumably the beam has dissipated and doesn't do as much damage. But I'll just quote directly from the Next Generation Tactics Manual about phasers, actually. And it says, the tactical value of phaser energy at warp velocities and even high relativistic velocities is close to none. So basically that means to shoot a beam of light at something when you're going faster than the speed of light isn't all that useful. It would probably be like shooting a spit wad out of a car traveling at 80 miles per hour, right? It's not going anywhere. Might come back and hit you in the face. So it's a short range weapon, and so if they're flying around at close to the speed of light, even there it's not that useful. But if they're flying around at the normal impulse speeds, which is somewhere under 25% the speed of light, then phasers are effective. And presumably phasers seem quite accurate. They don't seem to miss very often, they can oftentimes hold a steady beam on their target and presumably do a lot of damage. They're nowhere in any tech manual. I should say that they actually do give some numbers, but we have no idea what they mean. As far as, it talks about like the Phaser 10 on the Galaxy class starship, which is kind of what we'll talk about a little bit. But, I think each little phaser strip or link is worth like 5.5 megawatts of power. How that compares to the shield's ability to offset it, how that would damage the structure of the ship, there's no actual numbers given to be able to figure out exactly, to delineate exactly how much damage it causes. But anyways, so they're effective at relatively close range. But if you also think about this, that is actually, given the speeds that they're flying around, if everyone's flying around at 10,000 or 10% the speed of light, then and the weapon only has a maximum range of 300,000 kilometers. Well, 10% the speed of light is 30,000 kilometers per second. So in 10 seconds, one starship will have traveled the entire range of the phaser. So compared to the velocities they could be at, that's really a relatively close range. It might even be that a better comparison is jet fighters with with a cannon or a gun compared to the missiles that they have, as far as the range of the photon torpedoes. I mean, but if you think of the gun range compared to a jet fighter, I think a couple thousand yards is maybe the most that a gun's going to be accurate in a jet fighter, but it traverses that distance in seconds. So I know in Next Generation we see an awful lot of times where they're just sort of sitting there static, beak to beak, and so presumably it'd be really hard to miss, and they're usually really, really close. So, so that's kind of your phasers. They're going to be your close-in weapons, and and I think like we've talked about earlier, you probably don't have a guy. Your captain's probably not sitting there just staring at this giant view screen, going, "Okay, fire," because by the time he thinks it, says it, and the speed of sound traveling to your tactical officer, and by the time that those signals get processed and he presses a button, they're already out of your whatever optimum firing range. So you've probably got pre-programmed firing solutions where maybe the captain said, "All right, fire at 40,000 kilometers or something." Though we don't see, we don't really see that, because for dramatic effect, they're always, fire, doing that kind of stuff. So now the photon torpedo it talks about having a range of 3.5 million kilometers. So presumably that range is applicable while you're at warp. At sublight speeds, I don't think it would translate into that kind of firing range necessarily. But 3.5 million kilometers, I didn't sit down and do the math. If you're traveling, at warp 5 doing 300 times the speed of light, you're going to traverse that 3.5 million kilometers in a fraction of a second. So even that range isn't that much. So presumably even at warp, your firing envelopes are pretty narrow, and you're probably shooting at a ship that's roughly going the same speed, and you're probably going roughly the same direction. You're probably not doing anything too complicated. But at the very least, again, even more so, you're going to need your computer in there to be deciding exactly when the weapon is fired, if you have any chance of anything. So it is a warp weapon, and obviously the manual, the tech manual, basically says the warhead is basically 1.5 kilograms of matter and antimatter together, deuterium and antideuterium. And when it hits its target, it shoves those things together, and you get a great big explosion. And I've heard various descriptions of different people and interpretations on how many megatons that turns out to be. So I couldn't tell you exactly what it equates to in that. I saw somebody do a calculation, and I have no idea if he's right. Came up with 64 megatons. So, but again, I have no way of knowing, or I'm no nuclear physicist or anything like that, so I couldn't tell you. And let's see if there was anything else. So, and the other thing is photon torpedoes are generally, they have the matter and antimatter injected into the torpedo casing before firing. So when they say load torpedo bays, they're in there probably through some mechanism, and I'm sure lots of safety systems, squirting some antimatter in there and getting those torpedoes armed and ready. They're not stored, in an armed and ready mode. And then if we go, for anyone interested in a little more detail, for the Galaxy class ship, the torpedo tube each of the torpedo tubes got a forward tube and an aft tube. And I guess if you separate the saucer by itself would have an aft torpedo tube as well. But one of those torpedo tubes can load 4 torpedoes at a time with antimatter, and load 4 torpedoes at a time and load them into the torpedo tube. And then after it gets them all loaded, it can actually fire off 10 torpedoes in a single salvo at a target. So presumably that's a lot. From what we see compared to the movie era Enterprise, we see that one firing about 2 torpedoes. The most we ever see is 2 torpedoes come out of each one of the launching tubes. So presumably, the Enterprise class, the refit from the movies, can shoot off 4 photon torpedoes at a single shot, at a single volley. And then the other things they talk about is like as far as phaser types go, The Ambassador class, the predecessor to the Galaxy class, had Type 9 phasers. And we can see, if you look at the exterior pictures of an Ambassador class, its phaser strips, it's got those phaser strips just like the Enterprise D does. However, they're much smaller. So presumably they're less powerful, you know, all that kind of thing. And then the Excelsier's phasers got classified as Type 8 phasers. And those are the turrets that you see along the hull. You know, it's got five pairs of turrets on the top and 5 pairs of turrets on the bottom. And presumably there's some other phasers located throughout the hull that we saw from when Defiant fought the Lakota, which was an Excelsior class ship, and they fought each other to a standstill. So that's pretty much the next generation phasers and photon torpedoes. And the tech manual basically says the basic construction of the photon torpedo hasn't really changed much since about the time we see the motion picture Enterprise. It uses roughly the same basic thing. However, the current model in Next Generation has that 3.5 million kilometer range. So, and that's pretty much how those work. They do have a little information from the old series, and they talk about it in the Next Generation Tech Manual, as the old series, the original series Photon Torpedoes had a range of about 750,000 kilometers. So, with the phasers still being accurate out to 300,000 kilometers as well. Presumably, again, far less powerful, far less accurate, and all that kind of stuff than the phasers from Next Generation. And we made one mistake. I made a typo. So in the original series, you do see phasers firing at warp and stuff, but again, like you said, that's where they were highly inconsistent in how everything they did. But that's why in Starfleet battles, that game Wargames out battles that take place at warp speed. And so phasers are considered faster than light weapons in that game, in that universe. And, you know, that's almost like, that's also Starfleet battles. You should think of it as a separate timeline that branched off somewhere during the 5-year mission.
Part of the multiverse.
Yep, part of the multiverse, exactly. And in that case, photon torpedoes were very short-range weapons. By comparison, their effective range was, you know, you're looking at a 67% chance to hit at 40,000 kilometers, so you had to be pretty close. And the effective range of a phaser was roughly 80,000 kilometers. So, you know, much shorter range than what we deal with in what we see in the Next Generation. So in some ways it kind of fits. But of course, in 1975, when Amarillo Design Bureau or Starfleet Games at the time designed the game, you know, they didn't have the benefit of the movies or Next Generation or anything like that, because they did this in the 70s. So the only thing I will say is it is one of the most tactically interesting war games or spaceship combat games you know, I've ever played. It really goes into a lot of detail on stuff, and they really imagined and sort of they created tactics and systems that kind of became fairly logical evolutions of what you think they might be doing. You know, like for instance, they had quite a few different tactics. I won't go too much farther into this, but you know, like you could arm a shuttle and use it as a bomb, basically. You know, they call them suicide shuttles. You know, you load some antimatter onto an antimatter bomb onto a shuttle, and you launch the shuttle at somebody. Of course, it moves at low warp and can probably be avoided or shot down. You know, stuff like that. So the other thing is, as far as I can tell, photon torpedoes are considered guided weapons, so they can adjust their course after their target and that sort of thing too. Though, of course, what you see on screen is it generally goes in a straight line and hits the target, or it goes in a straight line and misses the target. So we don't see a lot of, except for Star Trek VI, we don't see a lot of, you know, like you see in the movies with heat-seeking missiles where the ship is being chased around by the missile. You know, you don't see much of that. And, you know, it either hits or it misses pretty quick. So, So that's pretty much all I've got for base. What we put on the slides. And I will say for the next generation, Balance of Terror is kind of like the first space battle that we see, and pretty much on television, kind of the first. Let's call it the first modern space battle. In that one, they had not invented photon torpedoes yet. So that's kind of why you see, and they hadn't defined what a photon torpedo was or a phaser was at that time. And so you hear them talking about firing proximity fused phaser blasts and stuff like that. And you see these explosions in the distance. So in my mind, he's saying photon torpedo and it just got dubbed the wrong way or something like that. Or the Hollywood version of the actual events got it wrong. So that's just how I think of it, because they do use phasers more appropriately at different times in Balance of Terror, where they're actually close to the Romulan and they fire off the phasers like you would expect. But their long range shots, that uses the special effect that we've come to know as the photon torpedo for the most part. So, but after that, they start using photon torpedoes and phasers, and they're kind of distinctly different, and they kind of get that those special effects correct.
Gotcha.
So,
well, this is pretty thorough, boy. That was way more than I expected. We're good. I hope everyone got it. Can you send me a copy of that I can publish for everyone?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
What we'll do is we'll put it up on the Axanar website, and we'll put it on the Axanar Facebook page, and that way, because this is great. I mean, it's so you have more slides.
Well, so a lot of those are notes I took because I've been essentially mining Star Trek. So like Starfleet Battles was a game I used to play a long time ago. I've been mining Star Trek to create a Star Trek based on all the information we have from Next Generation. Make a Star Trek Starship combat game. And so I've been mining all of this stuff and figuring out, I've done the time, speed, distance, and to make sure it all works and it's accurate and the ranges are good and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of those are just my notes. They're not really made for
fair enough.
Public.
Yeah, fair enough. No. As long as we get the chart, we'll publish the chart. That would be great. I'm sure everyone will get a kick out of that. So that's awesome. All right. So now that Pat has overwhelmed us with unbelievable, and now I know why you're on Bu 9. Let's just talk about how is this idea of photon torpedoes versus phasers, the generic concept of these weapons. How does this play out across science fiction in general? Do we see see this as a trope? Do we see this as a kind of like the gold standard? How is this played out in other franchises or other science fiction of note?
So we see some things that are very similar in various pieces. I mean, phasers are sort of the generic ray gun weapon, right?
Yeah, right.
So we see a lot of generic ray gun weapons. That in lots of science fiction.
And why don't you, Chris? Explain to everyone the difference between lasers and phasers? Or Pat, who is that a better for an uber geek like Pat to explain?
So in theory, phasers do this thing involving rapid nadion.
Yeah. And I don't pretend to know.
Force. Blah 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 blah.
You said it as well as I could.
Yeah, so it's not really. It's like I know what all those words mean individually, but when you put them all together, I don't know what that means.
All right.
But I believe they call it a rapid nadion effect, and again, I don't know what that means.
And so when push comes to shove, I mean, if you go back and you read the making of Star Trek. It basically boils down to lasers were brand spanking new. And so that guy gave you most of the name because they wanted something that rhymed with laser. And they originally were going to call them lasers, but then they realized, like, this is so new that we don't know what this is yet. And there was a situation where they were afraid that if they used a specific term like laser 2 years from now, people were going to be saying, well, lasers can't do that. And so they just made up a similar sounding term and ran with it. Photon torpedoes are a little bit more interesting. I mean, antimatter warheads are one of those things that you see in science fiction. This idea of you know, a photon torpedo as conceived from, I don't know if you can say from the motion picture on, because the photon torpedoes, the first time we ever saw an unfired photon torpedo was in Wrath of Khan. Up until that point, what we saw was a special effect coming out of the model of the ship. We didn't see actually what one looked like in its unfired state. And, you know, for a while there, you had some very interesting things taking place in all the fandom publications as people were trying to sort of fill in these gaps that existed, right? So what exactly is a photon torpedo? My favorite explanation, which is not the one that the people who made the movies went with, is that the photon torpedo, that the weapon is actually the tube. The photon torpedo itself, other than having some antimatter and matter squirted into it so that they can mix, the rest of it's just a field effect of some sort. And so basically the tube generates this sort of pocket of energy that keeps the matter and antimatter apart and then eventually mixes them. And as a result of that, it's pretty much a straight firing weapon. You point the tube at the target and it runs in a straight line like a straight running torpedo does. And I went looking through my various sources to see if I can find it, but my favorite explanation, it talked about how, you know, like this one ship had a photon torpedo tube that would generate a more powerful photon torpedo, but it was shorter range. That field degraded faster. Things like that I found sort of interesting. And you see occasionally things like that in other science fiction series. My all-time favorite series is one called Exordium by Sherwood Smith and Dave Trowbridge. And in it, they have a weapon called the skip missile, which is, it doesn't have antimatter in it, but what it does is it fires a very small amount of plasma that skips in and out of hyperspace. And it's moving very fast when it's in real space. So when you get hit by like 10 pounds of plasma moving at 99.9 C, it'll leave a mark. And it expands over time, so the farther out that it's shooting, the bigger the effect it has, but the smaller amount of damage that it does for any given square. Like
the Romulan plasma weapon in Battlestar?
Yeah, kind of like that. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like that.
Gotcha.
So if you go back to Doc Smith, you find lots of different interesting weapon systems where it's never really quite clear what it translates into in real world terms. Doc Smith is really interesting to read now because it's like reading Lord of the Rings. If you don't know the history, you read this and go, man, this is horrible. It's full of nothing but cliches. They weren't cliches when he wrote them.
Yeah.
So the first person to do all that stuff always ends up sounding really trite when you go back later and look at it.
So, what is a quantum torpedo?
All yours, Pat.
So a quantum torpedo is, they realized that they had reached, according to the tech manuals, they realized that they had reached the theoretical maximum of a matter-antimatter warhead of what they call 50 isotons. I have no idea what an isoton is, nor how it equates to megatons or any other form of energy expenditure. And they believe they can get it up to a theoretical maximum. Gosh, it was like a 50% increase in damage potential, I think. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure why I'm suddenly blanking on it, but and it talks about, it uses like 0 point energy. I think they took the latest and greatest physics words that they could throw into the quantum torpedo. Yeah, and applied it. So basically, you're talking about something that's very powerful. much more powerful than photon torpedoes. And in Next Generation, according to the books and everything like that, they were very hard to produce. They couldn't replicate. So ammunition was limited, and not everybody had just gobs of them on board. For instance, the Galaxy class has 275 torpedo casings, three quarters of which were configured for photon torpedoes. The other 25% of them could be reconfigured with, probes and all this other telemetry stuff and, secret squirrel, information and scientific gathering things. And so they had lots of photon torpedoes and casings and all that kind of stuff aboard their ships. But a limited number of ships actually got the quantum torpedo. So the Defiant was considered one because it was on the front lines with the Dominions. You notice that the station itself in Way of the Warrior or any other time never lobbed off any quantum torpedoes. They were only on the Defiant, and then obviously we see them. Enterprise E got some of the more modern ships had them. I think in the Akira class is one that's got one or two of its forward launch tubes on the top of the roll bar. It had quantum torpedoes that it could fire, along with side-mounted and various aft-mounted photon torpedo tubes. So it could squirt out a whole bunch of torpedoes. It's basically an artillery ship. And then presumably Voyager, I guess maybe since it was assigned into that area initially, had some quantum torpedoes aboard too. But they could not be easily replicated. They were far more powerful. And then in First Contact, we see that a volley of 4 of them, I believe, takes out a Borg, spherical ship. So presumably they're quite powerful. And when in the battle with the cube initially, right, Picard knew that little spot to fire, and everyone fired torpedoes and phasers into that spot, but the quantum torpedoes got lobbed in there and took out an entire cube. So it's the Federation's adaptation, I believe, to the Borg threat, along with a lot of the new ships.
So being that we now have phasers and photon torpedoes for 50-something years in it, let me ask you this, because you guys both read science fiction. What is the most interesting weapon that you've read in science fiction? And let's stick to ship-based weapons, not planet-killing planets.
Yeah,
planet-killing movies.
Nothing J.J. Abrams created would make my list.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's all science fantasy. It's not science fiction.
Yeah, Chris, I'm gonna hand that one off to you.
Yeah,
you've got a. Yeah, that one's yours.
I'm sort of cycling through I'm looking for something that isn't that what makes it interesting isn't just that it's bigger.
Right.
Shouldn't be that hard a question.
And even in the just for example, in the Star Trek universe, the Klingons and Romulans have disruptors.
Mm-hmm.
They're basically a different weapon than a phaser.
So I'm going to go. My tendency. I kind of knew where I was going to where I was probably going to end up, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just being an Exordium fanboy here. There's a couple of weapons in the Exordium universe that are kind of unique. I already talked about the one, the skip missile, which is their faster than light weapon. It can shoot out to about 14 light seconds. The other one is something called a Ruptor. And Ruptors fire gravitons, which is the theoretical particle that carries gravitational force. If your gravitons are all polarized the same way, you've got a tractor beam or a pressor beam or whatever. So you can use that. That's how you do stuff. Like at one point, they need to abandon ship from one of the vessels in a battle, and they use the Ruptor turrets to push the shuttles to give them a good initial push so that they can get out of the field of the battle. But if your gravitons you're firing are unpolarized, when they hit, they sort of pull the target in different directions. And so basically you get vibrated to death. If you're lucky, you get vibrated. Well, actually, if you're unlucky, you get vibrated to death. If you're lucky and you're going to die anyway, you basically disappear in this cloud of mist as all the different parts of your body move in different directions at the same time. But that's relatively quick. The thing is, these weapons are actually incredibly dangerous to be around because the radiation that they give off is stray gravitons. And so in the book, canonically, so the only ships that have them are battle cruisers. Battle cruisers are basically egg-shaped ships that are 7 kilometers long. Their internal volume is 92 kilometers. You would think that a 92-kilometer ship would have a lot of space on the inside for the crew. It actually doesn't. It's a fairly tight fit because most of that 92 kilometers is just blocks of asteroidal metal whose function it is to soak up the radiation from the Ruptor turrets, of which it's got 6, and from the radiation from the reactors and other stuff. So the actual habitable area is pretty small. A Ruptor turret itself is 1 kilometer in diameter, but it's fired by remote control because you don't want to be anywhere near it when it goes off. It's too dangerous. So this is my favorite science fiction weapon, probably.
The Starfleet battles kind of had each different empire had its own unique weapon. So this game actually modeled things like the Tholian web and how you used it in a battle and stuff. And you would cast web out there, and that web could then trap a ship and cause it to not be able to move. And then you could gain an advantage as a Tholian flying around somebody. Basically it's like you could cast these tractor beam areas where kind of like you create terrain in space, and you could use that to really great effect. So the Tholian web, which was modeled, was very interesting. There was an empire called the Lyrans in there, and sometimes they do get mentioned in different places, but they had basically, they called it an expanding sphere generator, where it's basically a giant ramming device. It would create a giant field around the ship, and then you would use that to ram other ships and stuff. And used properly, it could do a lot of damage. And used improperly, you waste a lot of power and get killed horrifically. So there were some interesting weapons in there. Babylon 5, I believe, they had an interesting variety of weapons as far as another TV based show. And you had asked about sort of the tropes between beams and stuff like that. In Babylon 5, the laser cannons on the the Earth Alliance destroyers and stuff, those seem to be kind of the long range weapons. And we'd see things like pulse weapons, but they had the ability to shoot down various energy or particle weapons. So not only could they shoot down a missile, they could shoot down particle weapons. So they had that kind of targeting accuracy, because we see that kind of stuff happening where there are little pulse weapons going after a ship, and they're able to shoot them down and stop them. And so instead of shields, those were the kind of defenses that they had in Babylon 5. So it was a different dynamic. It was still pretty interesting though. What's that? Go ahead.
I was going to say, I thought of another one that I would add to my list too.
All right.
Meson guns from Traveler. So the idea was that it's a particle that decays somewhat explosively, and you prevent the decay from happening by firing it at the speed of light, or close to the speed of light, and you can time it. So basically it's something that can penetrate through some level of shielding, and then it decays inside the target. And there's all sorts of interesting things, like you can bury your weapons underground, and they can fire from underground through the ground and still be able to hit stuff out in space. And that's interesting in a couple of ways, because if you think about it, naval artillery, like big guns, are point-to-point weapons. They're not line-of-sight weapons, or they're not like a laser. If you point it at something and you've got the range wrong, it doesn't matter. You're still pointing a laser at it, right? It's a direct line of sight weapon. It's a direct fire weapon like that. Whereas cannon, because you're firing up, if you've got the range wrong, you either end up landing in front of it or behind it, right? You need to know the range. You can't just point and shoot. Meson guns actually function more like naval artillery than they do like lasers. And I find that interesting. It makes the tactical problem harder because now you have to think about range more than you would have to before. So that I'd add to the list.
So the other thing with photon torpedoes, I'll just, without going into a lot of detail, unless you want more, I will say that there are some tactics that come up with the photon torpedoes. So we hear in, going back to the Balance of Terror, we hear that, so I'm going to pretend that was photon torpedoes he was firing. And I think we hear it in other times. And then in that Starfleet Battles game I mentioned, they had this capability where you can set your photon torpedo for proximity fuse. It does less damage because presumably it's in an area of explosion. So, but it has a better chance to hit, which makes complete sense. It was kind of their equivalent of a depth charge, but it kind of makes sense when you're shooting at something where you don't know exactly where it is. You'd fire that proximity fuse torpedo. And so that's one of the tactical options that you have with the photon torpedo. There are a couple other options, and we see this in Next Generation. I think it's Soldiers of the Empire, where they're on Martok's on Rotaran. They're running away from a bunch of Jem'Hadar ships that are overtaking them. And they do this thing called sensor blinding, where they fire off a volley of torpedoes to explode somewhere between them and whoever might be shooting at them. And it can cause the enemy to lose sensor lock. Presumably this only lasts for a couple seconds, but it might be the couple seconds that makes a difference. And so that was a way to sort of blind your enemy. Think of it as throwing sand in their eye or something like that for a few seconds. So that was one of the tactical options in Next Generation that we see with photon torpedoes to use. And the other tactic that you hear about, and to be honest, I'm not sure where it comes from, but they call it shield dimpling, where the idea is that you fire a very focused burst of phasers on a very focused burst of phasers on someone's shields to create a small hole in the shield of the ship. And the idea is then you time it just right so that you're firing your photon torpedo to fly through that small gap in the shields. So that way your photon torpedo is impacting against the hull of the ship. And so, with the idea of causing more damage and stuff like that. So those are some of the different tactical options that we've heard about with the game, with the show and everything throughout over time. And I'm sure there's a few others. If I dug really hard, I could come up with a couple others. But those are some of the tactics involved in the weapons that they use.
Well, there you go. That's pretty damn thorough, Pat. Thank you. People are like, wow, that's way more than I ever want to know about phasers and photon torpedoes. But hey, people, now you know. Now you can call bullshit on the next season of Discovery or Picard or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah. So
yes,
good.
For the record, we pay a lot more attention to this stuff than any showrunner in the history of Star Trek ever paid on any of this stuff. Now, people like Mike Okuda and Rick Sternbach and I can't remember, Andrew Probert, those people took this stuff real seriously.
Yeah, Doug Drexler,
I knew I was missing somebody from the list. Those people all take that stuff real seriously, but
thank you.
Rick Berman, not so much.
Right. Well, listen, at some, here's the other the other challenge, and that is that at some point you've got writers saying, yeah, guys, you're getting in the way of my story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And that's it. There's a point where you're like, oh, and certainly when I was writing Axanar, I always tried to pay attention to the science, the fictional science as much as you possibly could,
Right.
and really try and make things realistic. Because you don't, I was listening to the Mission Log podcast today, and they were talking about how in this one episode of Deep Space Nine, they're on the Defiant and they're on the turbolift, and they're like going and going and going in the turbolift, and like, dude, it's got like 2 decks.
Slowest turbo lift ever.
Yeah, exactly. They're seeing the little lights flash by, and they're like, it was funny. The guy who, the podcaster was like, I went and checked out my blueprints of the Defiant, and it doesn't have that many decks, So that's where, there has to be a happy medium.
Well, one thing with the turbo lifts, remember, they can go sideways along the length of the ship. They don't just go up and down necessarily. Yes. And I don't know the turbo lift configuration of the Defiant or anything. But yeah.
Exactly. By the way, I hated that in Discovery, that you saw the turbo lifts, the inners, because
that was
Was that awful? Were you guys as offended as I was?
At what? I'm sorry.
I was kind of
inside of the turbo lifts and seeing that it was just like an elevator on rails that was in this huge cavernous space. You're like, what are they wasting all that space for?
Yeah. So if you get one of those books that they just recently published, it shows the Discovery at like 750 meters, which for the record, the old series Enterprise is 300 meters. The Galaxy class is 642 meters. So it's bigger than the Galaxy class according to their information. The sizes don't make any sense, and I just don't even I just close my eyes and plug my ears.
So I went into I took advantage. Oh, go ahead, Pat. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, someone put up a question: what's the minimum torpedo, or what's the minimum safe range you can fire a torpedo? The book has it at between 15 kilometers and 3.5 million kilometers you can fire them, though presumably you'd get a little bit of blowback damage. And they even address it once in the Next Generation, how they would take some amount of damage if they fired a torpedo at a really close range. So, and even Starfleet battles had feedback damage. If you fired at really close range there, you would take 25% of the warhead strength against your own shields if you fired at someone at point blank range.
It doesn't say it anywhere in the Next Gen Tech Manual, but I was just sitting here thinking about it. It's realistic to think that those are dial-a-yield warheads.
They are dial-a-yield warheads.
Okay, because you can make it dial-a-yield in 2 ways. By the amount of antimatter you put in there, and they talk about their fancy system for getting the matter and antimatter to mix properly. Because the big problem with doing an explosion like that is it's sort of like the same problem they had with the atomic bomb. The problem isn't getting it to do something highly extroverted. The problem is making it as efficient as possible, because it has a tendency to blow itself apart before it gets the opportunity to efficiently blow itself apart. Right?
Yeah, it talks about a little containment field that slows down, down or concentrates the explosion.
Yeah, basically it allows it to intermix, and then they shut off the field, and as a result, they get a lot more surface area interacting, and they get a lot more boom out of it. Because like if you just do if you take 2 pieces of plutonium, a bomb-grade plutonium, and bring them close to each other, you'll get something that will be a bad enough thing to kill you, but you won't get a nuclear explosion. You have to bring them together pretty fast to make that happen. So dial-a-yield warheads, dial-a-yield warheads are something that actually exist in the real world. They do it by, you start with a fission weapon, and then you inject into it tritium, to give you extra neutrons to make the fission more efficient. And as a result of that, even if it's a multi-stage weapon where you eventually end up with fusion, by doing that, you can end up with a dial-a-yield warhead where you can do it can be 5 to 25 kilotons, for instance. So you could theoretically, like, if you can do that with photon torpedoes, you can maybe make the backblast a little bit less.
Yeah, even in Enterprise, the weapons officer, suddenly I'm blanking on his name, when they're getting their very, Malcolm, when they're getting their very first photonic torpedo. So even there, he talks about we can dial the yield and we can choose to just blow off the antenna of a shuttle if we want to, as opposed to, blowing up a whole ship. And then if you see those little, I think they call them spatial torpedoes that they fired in the first couple episodes before they got their actual photonic torpedoes, those were useless little missiles that, anybody they ran into would just shoot them down or they'd bounce off the field, right? So
exactly.
So they've come a long way.
Yeah, indeed. Well, listen, we're going to wrap it up. I want to say thank you guys for a wonderful discussion. Probably the most in-depth discussion of photon torpedoes versus phasers that YouTube has ever seen.
There's more.
Huge. Millions and millions of people watched tonight. And thanks so much, guys. I appreciate it. So I'm thinking next weekend we talk about shields. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
You got another PowerPoint you're going to pull out, Pat?
On that one, there's much less information about it, but one of the interesting one of the interesting things you can talk about, I guess, a little bit is if you hit an unshielded ship with one photon torpedo, does it explode? But the answer appears to be no, based on on-screen evidence, right? We've seen that happen in Star Trek II. We saw it in Star Trek Generations, where for all practical purposes, ships were unloading on each other unshielded, and it doesn't. So they're made of something really strong, and probably those structural integrity fields help out too.
For something that one of the things that's sort of a recurring theme is for 64 megatons of explosive power, those are pretty small explosions.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about explosions in space, you don't have shock effects. It's all direct blast. It has to be it's all fireball basically.
Right.
So nuclear weapons are a lot less destructive in space than they are on a planetary surface or even in the atmosphere. But that having been said, you see actually hitting the ship. Wasn't it a photon torpedo that took out the roll bar on the Reliant?
Yeah,
correct.
Yes, it was.
It was. It's really that's all the damage it did.
I know, really?
Yeah.
You just knocked off my roll bar?
So I assume their defensive technology and their structural integrity fields and whatever magical stuff they make their ships out of is pretty damn tough. And it might, I'm just going by what we see on screen. I'm not trying to apply the actual physics
understood,
to it.
But that actually goes back to a comment that Alec made earlier about the writers, the script writers, etc. And sort of they're trying to tell the story, and they sort of make that stuff up to tell the story. So there's really sort of two different ways I think you can go wrong on something like this, like science fiction, right? One way you can go wrong is I'll just make up whatever I need to make my current story work. And the other way that you can go wrong is you forget something. There's a logical implication of what you've come up with, and it turns out that you didn't think it through. And as a result of it, you've got people saying well, yeah, but wouldn't they do X? And sort of oh shit, I'd never even thought about the possibility of X, right? So TV very much works, and movies very much works on that former mechanism, right? Their failure mode is usually that it's I don't care that the neutral zone with the Romulans is really far away. I want it to be about 3 hours away. So in First Contact, we'll make it about 3 hours away. So you can get to Romulan space in about 3 hours, or at least the neutral zone. It's oh, really? Okay. I'll just throw out everything I knew out the window.
Time, speed, distance is always a problem. But
David Weber, on the other hand, David's a big believer in the Honorverse. David has always said writers do better work when they have limitations. Mm-hmm. And so he always tries to figure out what the technology is capable of doing and write all that stuff down at the beginning of the process. Now, he makes changes. Things evolve over time as questions come up as he goes. Every now and then there's a little, maybe I'll tweak it a little bit to make this thing fit. But you write the limitations down, and then you live within the limitations, because that's where the good stories come from, is from people dealing with limitations. And that includes the writer dealing with the limitations. So this is one of the things why I think in some ways the written medium is a pure medium, because you don't end up with people just saying, well, but I got to have a commercial break there, so I'll just not do that. Or, yeah, they've got shuttlecraft. Maybe if we don't mention them, then we don't have to worry about somebody figuring it out. When I, as a 10-year-old, figured out that, they should have used the shuttlecraft to rescue Sulu. Yeah, that's exactly.
That's another one right there. Yep, exactly.
So straight stick Star Trek is really bad about this stuff, but at least there were some people trying to make an effort to get that right. JJ just makes shit up. So as far as I'm concerned, JJ Abrams listed on a movie is a warning label.
I can't disagree. I can't disagree. So,
yeah.
Well, listen, there's a lot of stuff we can talk about. I want to save it for next week. It's been a great discussion, guys. Thank you so much. We will next week we'll talk about structural integrity fields and inertial dampeners and shields and all the good stuff that holds a ship together, and how
that'll be great. I love that.
There's a great quote that Matt Shaver said is the quote from J. Michael Straczynski. When people ask him how fast ships travel in hyperspace, he said the speed of the plot.
That's right. Fast as they need to.
Well, and it's like what Mike Akuto would always say when somebody asked how the Heisenberg compensator worked. He'd say, "Very well, thank you."
That's why it's a compensator. So, all right, everyone. Thanks so much. It was great. That was a great chat. Gentlemen, have a good rest of this Saturday evening for you guys.
Take care.
Everyone out there in TV land, thank you so much. It was great having you on. This is becoming one of the best nights of the week, Saturday night for our show. Really enjoy it. We will see you tomorrow night at 10, and we'll be back with Axanar After Dark and talk about a lot of cool things that are happening. And listen, as always, please check out our Patreon campaign as well as the Aries Studio store at ariesstudios.net and help support the studio. Got great things happening. We're really excited. I'm just about to put out another update about our big plans for finally getting back into it now that COVID-19 is still kicking our ass, but we're going to shoot anyway. So there you go. So thanks so much. We'll talk to you all.
Stay safe, everybody.
Stay safe, stay healthy, wear your mask out in public. Cheers.
All right. Cheers.